Okay, so we left off talking about whether or not just having a specific resource, water or oxygen or heat, is really enough. If just having those things are enough, or if there's a specific quality or quantity that's necessary in order to sustain life. So in this particular section, we're going to talk about homeostasis. Right? Homeostasis is a pretty easy thing to grasp. It's the idea of maintaining an constant internal environment. It's the idea that no matter what's going on outside the body, inside of the body needs to stay within a specific range in order for the body to optimally perform. So, for example, outside, it may be 65 degrees Fahrenheit. However, we all know that the inside of your body needs to maintain its constant internal temperature. And we know that that's 98.6, right? 98.6 degrees. That doesn't mean that just because outside is so cold that our internal temperature starts to drop, right? Because as soon as our internal temperature starts to drop, perhaps we go to 97 degrees Fahrenheit, we have a mechanism that allows it to kick back up to 98.6. We shiver, right? That shivering is going to generate some heat and raise your body temperature. So homeostasis is the idea that there are all these different mechanisms in place within your body in order to maintain that stable internal environment. All right? So the idea that the body is going to monitor inside and be paying attention to any changes. If changes occur, right, the key thing is that corrections will be made. Just like I just mentioned with body temperature. The inside of your body, the temperature is being monitored. As soon as it changes, as soon as there's some sort of adjustment or altering, a correction is implemented in order to fix the internal environment. Right? The way that those mechanisms are going to work is by three different parts. Those three different parts are a receptor, control center, and an effector. All right, so there's going to be something that's going to, a receptor, we're talking about receiving, right? A receptor is what's going to actually receive the stimulus, receive the information about that change in the environment. So, for example, a receptor may be a nerve ending, right? A nerve ending may be able to sense a change in the environment. A control center, right? That control center is going to have a set point value. Body temperature, the set point value would have been 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. All right? Set point value is going to be where the internal environment wants to maintain values. And when it deviates from that specific set point value, the correction will be made. Effectors are what are really going to respond. Right? They're going to respond to that change. So sometimes these can be muscles, right? A muscle, this can be an organ, right? All different things can operate as an effector. In the case of shivering, like we talked about before, a muscle would be the effector, right? Because the muscle contraction is what's going to generate that shivering function, right? In order to change the internal environment and correct the altering value. Right? So this is kind of just an idea as to how exactly the receptors, control center, and the effectors are going to work. So a stimulus is going to be introduced into the environment, right? Is going to alter the internal environment, and a receptor is going to notice the change. Right? That noticed change is going to be sent to a control center, right? The control center does a comparison, right? Control center says, is that change acceptable? Is it too far away from our set point value? Are we deviating too far? And if necessary, that control center will then contact the effectors, and the effectors are what are actually going to create a response, right? The effectors are going to be able to fix the difference, right? So it's important for us to understand that this whole entire system kind of works together. In addition, we have two different types of mechanisms. The most typical type of mechanism for homeostasis is negative feedback, right? Negative feedback is the most common way that most of our homeostasis mechanisms are going to be working. So the idea is that it works very similar to how a thermostat can work, right? The idea that when the deviation gets corrected, right, the correction is going to reduce how that effector is responding. So the idea that when your thermostat, right, recognizes, right, when a temperature in the room changes and your heat kicks on, right, it's not going to continuously run the heat. It's going to run the heat and it's going to start to warm up the room, and as the room progressively gets warmer, it will be heated less and less until the heat can turn off, right? So it's a negative feedback loop to make sure that we don't go from being at a constant internal environment to being slightly off, and when we try to correct it, we wind up overcorrecting, and then we have to correct for that overcorrection, and we wind up overcorrecting that, and it becomes a very unstable internal environment, right? So the negative feedback allows it to stabilize and kind of maintain that constant internal environment, that, as we said, homeostasis. So the idea that sweating, you sweat more as you need to decrease your body temperature. As your body temperature starts to reach closer to 98.6, sweating starts to slow, right? Heart contractions. Your heart will beat harder and faster to supply your body based on its demands. It's not going to continually do that after those demands are being met. So it's important to recognize that a negative feedback will make sure that if it gets close to the set point value, the effectors, all right, the actual changes, the corrections, will be slowed down or will be diminished so as not to overcorrect for the deviation. Then, just like we have negative feedback mechanisms, we also have positive feedback mechanisms. However, a positive feedback mechanism operates substantially different from a negative feedback. Instead of actually correcting the deviation from the set point value, what's actually happening in a positive feedback homeostatic mechanism is that the deviation is being created, right? The idea is that something in the environment is actually prompting the internal environment to temporarily, right, very short-lived, temporarily for the internal environment to deviate from that set point value, right? And the reason is that whatever deviation it's creating is absolutely necessary for life. So, for example, right, a great example is injury. Injury causes blood clotting. Typically, you want your internal environment, right, your blood, to not clot on a consistent basis, right? Clotting on a consistent basis would cause substantial problems with blood flow, obviously. Instead, what's actually going to happen is that in the case of an injury, right, we're going to go from a low clotting factor to suddenly the clotting factor is going to jump, all right? And the reason for that jump is to repair the injury temporarily, and then clotting factor can drop back down, then we can go back to maintaining our internal environment, right? It's a quick deviation, right, from the set point value in order to fix some sort of error somewhere, some sort of problem. Another example, contractions during childbirth. Typically, right, a female is not looking for those contractions on a consistent basis. But those contractions, right, that abnormal body functioning, that abnormal internal environment needs to occur for that short amount of time in order for childbirth to occur. So a positive feedback mechanism works opposite. In a negative feedback, right, the actual deviation is being corrected, right? The body does not want deviation. In a positive feedback mechanism, the deviation is being created. Temporarily, for a really short amount of time, the body wants to deviate from homeostasis, wants to deviate from that constant internal environment. And the reason for that is necessary for life, right? So it's important for us to recognize that both these positive and negative feedback mechanisms are necessary in order for organisms to sustain life, that both have their specific place in the human body. That wraps it up for our lesson on homeostasis. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to see me.